People always talk about when things will go back to normal, and that's totally understandable. But I do wonder if anyone's actually stopped to think about whether back to normal is really the best thing.
Well, this is going to be embarrassing. Hey folks, it's Thomas and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be revisiting a video that I made just over 2 years ago now, back in the first COVID lockdown here in Scotland. In that video, I talked about how I didn't want universities to go back to normal once the lockdown was over. Well, that was over 2 years ago now. Since then, we've had another 2 lockdowns, another 3, 4, 5, 6 notable variants depending on who you ask. And we've also had 2 academic years at university under pandemic restrictions. So, do I still think that we shouldn't go back to normal once COVID restrictions are all gone and it's not a big problem anymore? Well, if I told you that right now, that would kind of spoil the rest of the video. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the main points from that video from 2 years ago, and let's have a think, let's have a discussion. Let me know in the comments below what you think. And I'm going to go over what I think now with 2 years of experience of the pandemic and university under pandemic restrictions. I've grown up quite a bit in the last 2 years. I've done a lot of stuff that I hadn't done then, both academically and non-academically. So I think my worldview has changed quite a bit. I think my perception of a lot of things has changed quite a bit. So let's go through these like section by section and see what's changed. Also, just so you know, it's like 27.5 degrees in my room right now. This is the hottest day of the year. Yes, I'm in Scotland. So we're used to temperatures colder than the rest of the UK. While London's at 40 degrees, like it's still really hot here for us because we're used to like 12 at most. We don't like the heat. Just so you know, I'm recording this without the fan on because it would ruin the audio. It's why I have Iron Brew. My ice has melted. So first, a reminder of the context that I made that video in. In March 2020, it was becoming increasingly apparent that COVID-19 was going to be a big deal, a big problem that would cause massive disruption. When lockdown hit, universities decided to send students home, the ones that could anyway, and moved everything online. So lectures went online, tutorials went online, labs went online, and exams went online. All anyone was talking about in the media at the time was when things would go back to normal. And to an extent, people still do talk about that, going back to normal. Annoyingly, it's mostly government. But when I made that video, I'd been seeing people struggle at university. Struggle with things that seemed fixable. And I'd seen the universities bring in measures really quickly as soon as the pandemic required it. And some of them were things that were asked for years before the pandemic hit. Now, lecture capture. This became near ubiquitous at universities as soon as pandemic restrictions were imposed. Bits of software like Panopto were used almost everywhere to let students get their lecture material asynchronously, so you didn't have to be on a Teams call with the lecturer. The lecturer would record the video and you'd get it, kind of like academic YouTube. This was something that had been asked for years by disabled students, especially disabled students who have intermittent conditions, ones that can flare up and mean you can't attend a lecture. It's also useful if you're ill or you have to be in your flat because the pipes have burst or you've slept in. Lecture capture was always dismissed as this thing that was just too difficult to implement or wasn't important or would cause a decrease in attendance at in-person lectures, especially 9 AMs. 2 years ago, I said this.
Now that so many students have seen the benefit of lecture capture, and there's no longer the fear around using the technology for staff members, I think universities should embrace lecture capture. Universities need to embrace this technology, making it available for those who need it frequently and also those who need it just occasionally.
I still believe this, and as far as I'm aware, lecture capture is something that is going to be here to stay. It's very difficult to remove something like this once you've given it. It's also true that student campaigners and elected representatives in student unions came out in force. Disabled students have been asking for this for years, and once the universities provided this service, they did not want to let it go. So I know at least that St Andrews has said they're going to continue lecture capture. I don't know about other universities, but I think it's going to be here to stay for the vast majority, which is a good thing. I think this should stay. Frankly, the argument that 9 AM lectures will be badly attended because of this is crap. I had 9 AM lectures, and it's better to be in person than it is to be online. In-person lectures are designed to be taken in person. Lecture capture is a great tool for when you need it, when you need to catch up on something, sometimes when you just want to listen to an explanation again because you didn't quite catch it the first time. It's really useful. and it's thankfully something that I think is here to stay. Since that one's largely gone well, I'm going to move on to my next point from 2 years ago.
From my own experiences, being able to have a short video call with a lecturer or a tutor was far more effective and efficient in solving my problems than an email was. My suggestion is that, like with lecture capture, universities need to embrace video calling.
Something else that came out of the pandemic really quickly was moving to online video platforms such as Zoom and Microsoft Teams. Your opinions of those platforms may be varied, some may be good, some may be bad. It doesn't matter, these were brought in. My university went with Microsoft Teams. What this meant was that office hours were taken online. Office hours where you can go and speak to your lecturer about a problem you're having and get it solved. While it is now legal and in most cases preferable to have an in-person office hour with your lecturer so you can ask questions and get immediate feedback and have a good discussion, I'm still of the opinion that having these online video services like Zoom and Teams to have conversations through the internet with your lecturer for office hours are a really useful and really valuable means of communication. I gave the example 2 years ago about commuting students, or even just people who live within a town that you have to walk. So I live around 20 to 30 minutes walk from the physics building. If I'm not in the building that day and I have a question I want to ask my lecturer that's a little bit more complicated than something you'd put in an email, I have to walk 20 minutes to half an hour there and 20 minutes to half an hour back. That takes an hour out of my day that I wouldn't otherwise have to use for what could have been a 10 to 15 minute Teams call. Now, while a lot of us are sick to the back teeth of Teams and Zoom, using this technology to make life more efficient is really useful. It means not having to take time out of your day. Now, I can see the benefit of that here in St Andrews, where I am within walking distance of the School of Physics. I'm just thinking, if I was at Glasgow University or Edinburgh University, I would probably commute from home. That's then 2-3 hours commuting time, maybe even more, to ask something that could have been a 15-minute call. Email is still an option, but trying to do like scientific equations in an email sucks. It's really bad and nobody wants to do that. So I do still agree with what I said 2 years ago. Mostly. What I don't agree with is that it should be assumed to be the default. Since I made that video, I've spent a year as a class representative and a year as school president for physics and astronomy. I've seen just how busy the staff are, but I've also seen how much teaching staff value those personal connections with students, those face-to-face conversations that can lead to more than just answering some questions, but will also lead to getting to know them. Those sorts of relationships lead to internships, they lead to really interesting projects, they lead on to PhD places and interesting ideas which spark inspiration in the minds of the students and in the staff. While you could have these discussions through Zoom or through Teams, frankly, I've spent enough of the last 2 years on these platforms and I'm sick to the back teeth of them. What I think we should have is these platforms as an option, but that most people will go back to having a more normal office hour in person. The discussions through Teams and Zoom they've always felt a bit stinted. It's much easier to have a natural conversation and build a professional relationship in person. So I don't entirely agree with what I said 2 years ago. My third point was on exams. I was and am still in favour of somewhat changing exam formats from what they were pre-COVID. Let's see what I said 2 years ago.
So this is why I think we should look into keeping open book exams, at least to some extent. I'm not saying keep them in their present form, but I don't think we should go back to completely closed book exams.
Now at that point, I had done 4 semesters of university exams, 3 in-person closed book under normal pre-COVID life, and 1 under pandemic restrictions where they just took the papers we were going to have in person and just made them open book online. I'd had this experience of only really checking these like open book notes for equations, but since then I've had another 4 exam diets online open book. I've seen what happens with these exams, so a bit more experience now. Back then I was firmly in the camp of having more open book exams once the pandemic restrictions lift. I've somewhat changed my tune since then. I'm now, like with many things, neither in one camp nor the other. I'm not, yes we should make everything open book, and I'm not, yes we should go back to closed book for everything. I kind of live in a no man's land in between these where, I know compromise happens. What I think we need is something entirely new. Well, almost entirely new. Point 1. We can't continue to have Google. Being able to Google things in an exam is kind of destroys the whole idea of having exams. There's 2 reasons for this. Firstly, it makes it very difficult to make questions on things that are testing understanding that can't really easily be tested through a question. Pre-COVID, we'd have state what this thing is, and you just had to know it. It's hard to test whether you know something if it's not something that is specifically used to answer a question. It's just a concept you have to know, and anyone can Google a definition or an explanation. It kind of destroyed those questions. Secondly, it gives people a false sense of security. And I felt this myself, to be honest. The idea that you can just look things up instead of having to remember them, it leads people to waste time in exams. It's far too easy to spend valuable exam time Googling stuff to do with a question that you're having trouble with, rather than what you would do in an exam where you didn't have Google, which is just move on, do the questions you could do, and then come back to it. People have been having trouble completing exam papers over the last couple of years, and I think this is a big part of it, is just expecting to be able to find the answers if you can't remember them. Point 2 is that open book exams are very hard to standardize. I think there's value in having a much more controlled exam environment. It makes it a lot easier for lecturers to write fairer exams because they know what is in front of students. What we saw through the pandemic was some lecturers writing disproportionately harder exam papers because they were, I guess, assuming that there was more information in front of students, or they'd be able to find too much information far too easily to answer questions similar to what they'd set before. Not knowing what students would have in front of them made the whole exam taking experience so much worse. So what am I suggesting? What I'm suggesting is that we go back to mostly closed book exams. Exams in a lecture hall without access to the internet, without anything like that. There's invigilators walking up and down, you can't Google anything, and you can't bring things into the exam hall. What I am suggesting is that more information is provided to students by lecturers. So the lecturers know exactly what is in front of the students when they're sitting the exam, but so you're not having to remember things that you shouldn't need to remember because you would just look them up in real life. There's a module like this in physics at St Andrews. It's the third year electronics module. Now, I haven't taken this module because I'm an astrophysicist, not an experimental physicist, but I know people who've taken it and I trust them. In the electronics module, people are given a slimmed down version of the notes. So the notes is essentially like a big textbook, to be honest. It's quite a lot. And they get a much smaller version of that for the exams. They know what they're going to have at the start of the semester because they're given this slimmed down version, which means you can practice for the exam knowing what you're going to have in it. It also means that the lecturers know what you have in front of you, so they can set questions knowing that. I think this is a really good approach because it limits the amount of memorization that has to happen, which is ultimately pointless, to be honest, because you kind of forget most of it pretty quickly. And it means that exams are much better at testing how well the student knows the topic, not just how quickly can you Google something. So I've somewhat changed my tune over the last couple of years, but I've had a rather unique insight to how staff see this, to how it affects things behind the scenes, because I've been a class rep and I've been school president. It's an insight that not many students get. I think this has really benefited me in this area in terms of my view of this. Now, my final point from the video 2 years ago was that we shouldn't have as much weight on exams and should have more continuous assessment. This wasn't really a COVID specific thing. It's more a general point that it's a change I think we should make. It shouldn't have really been in the last video, so I'm not really going to go into it here. Just that 100% exam modules kind of just suck. It's really bad. So yeah, not going to go any further into that because it's not COVID specific. So those are my thoughts on 2 years ago me, but what about my general feelings about going back to normal? Overall, I think we do need to go a bit more back to normal than I did back then. But I think we need that really cliche phrase, a new normal. University did not work for everyone before the pandemic, especially minorities and people with disabilities. The pandemic exposed a lot of issues that were present in higher education. I think that as we transition back to a more normal university experience, we need to readapt to a world without COVID. Readapt, not revert. We need to take a serious look at how things work at universities and reshape them so that they work for everyone, not just for the traditionally academic demographics. So, congratulations for making it to the end of this video. Since you've made it this far, then you should subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any of my future videos. I'm making quite a lot of university content at the minute as we run up to the new semester. I'm going to be doing a university Q&A in a few weeks, so drop the questions down below and I'll answer them. And while you're down there, let me know what you think. Do you think we should go back to our pre-pandemic normal? Do you think we should have my new normal suggestions? Do you think we should have something else? I want this to be a discussion, so let me know down below. If you're looking for something else to watch, then why don't you check out these videos here? One of them was chosen by me, and one of them YouTube thinks you might like. All that's left for me to say is have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next one. See ya.